Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is an extract, but you already know and understand everything yourselves. You understand that all hopes for a truce, or at least a pause in the war in Ukraine, have been buried. And what's more, Putin used Trump himself as the shovel. Putin is staging a public and brazen execution, mocking the old man in Washington, and in general, clearly demonstrating his ability to push through his own will and his own mania. There are no illusions, nor should there be, because there is such an important indicator of the intentions of any dictator waging war, any deranged ruler. This indicator is repression. It is the best litmus test for measuring and tracking the progression of the disease. And we see that Putin is not only failing to stop the repressions, he's ramping them up, increasing the sentences to some astronomical levels. Well, just like a drug addict is forced to increase the dose to get the same high, right? He persecutes all the enemies of his mania, all the enemies of his illness, anyone who dares to approach this illness in a white coat with extraordinary force and malice. And at the same time, Trump once again had a conversation with the Kremlin page. Putin decided to congratulate Trump on his birthday. And unfortunately, Trump was at home. And he actually seems, unfortunately, to be even less aware than Biden. He doesn't understand that any contact he has with the Kremlin Trump and assurances that it was a wonderful, productive conversation basically wash away the last traces of the makeup of greatness from Trump. And the one who so wanted to go down in history as a great president of the United States can for now probably only aspire to the role of a great comedian, though still a lesser one than, say, Charles Spencer Chaplin. That is, alas, we see that Trump, who was undoubtedly, without question, initially presented as a Zeus, so to speak, turned out to be more like Zeus from amateur provincial theater, a make-believe Zeus. And all his thunderbolts turned out to be cardboard and secondhand. And all of this looks ridiculous. But of course, the only thing that could excuse Trump is if these conversations of his with the deranged Russian Führer are actually some clever maneuver, allowing for the pinpointing of the exact coordinates of Putin's bunkers for a visit from a large and effective missile. But even if everything Trump is doing now is some kind of clever plan, he has definitely overdone it. Even if this plan in the end culminates in the long cherished dream of civilized humanity coming true, the entirety of all the preliminary efforts, unfortunately, will shape Trump's image as that of a failed clown who manages neither to truly frighten nor amuse the audience, and who in general just aimlessly flounders around the political arena without much meaning or result. He really shouldn't have done that. I was just starting to warm up to him. Let us note, however, that the rallies scheduled today against Trump did not become nationwide events. They did not produce that vast sea of people endlessly outraged and angry. Well, at least judging by the materials that are already coming in and are available from correspondents in the US. To be honest, what we've seen so far isn't particularly impressive. But perhaps this bloodless, decorative, declarative, ordinary act of mass peaceful protest, it has generally been devalued worldwide. It is losing popularity. And if anything can bring people out onto the streets, it is only the promise of decisive action, fundamentally based on the desire and will for a real change of power. And as for the decla, fundamentally, the methods declared must be decisive and free from law-abidingness. And Putin likes all of this too, because he even enjoys this war between Israel and Iran, which seems shameful for Russia. And he understands that this is the kind of war where he can manage to hide in the shadow of a major Middle Eastern disaster together and quietly get on with his own maniacal schemes. Well, we see that Israel is smashing Iran, but Iran is responding extremely harshly and, let's say, is snapping back skillfully. Of course, the Jewish bombs have torn apart the obscurantist comfort of Iran. Cities are burning, and perhaps Iran's nuclear devices are burning too, at least according to the statements of Israeli politicians, but that's not the point. Later on, it will become clear what was actually destroyed, what is really burning, and what is just a play of imagination, those endless mirages that constantly arise in the minds of politicians, as we know. But let's note that these very first Jewish bombs have also blown holes in the Kremlin towers. Botok has suffered, and the very brick that Putin had long cherished as his own little NATO has twisted in pain, though, under the pretense that it is an economic, not a military alliance. And it became clear that no friendship with Moscow, no alliance with Moscow, thanks to these bombings, to these first bombings, so to speak, offers any protection or salvation whatsoever. After all, not so long ago, back in 2025, Iran and Russia officially signed the so-called Brotherhood Forever Treaty, further sealing their political affection, calling this historic agreement a comprehensive political partnership in which both parties essentially pledged to help and protect each other no matter what. This military political coitus between the two obscurantist regimes was passionate, it was rhythmic, but it lasted only until that fateful night when Israel started the war. It must be said that for several years, Iran had been tearing away shahids and shells from its own black heart, supplying the orc battalions in Ukraine. Iranian hackers were hammering European websites and networks, while various turban terrorists carried out delicate assignments for the Kremlin, blowing things up, setting fires, and cutting down whoever they were told to. But then those Jewish bombs were the first to fly, and once again the Russians abandoned their own, not even bothering to explain the reason for their swinish behavior. And all these agreements, all these BRICS alliances, which, by the way, Iran also recently and ceremoniously joined, turned out in the end to be just sham. The most that Russia turned out to be capable of was, well, a couple of carefully worded statements. Masha Zakharova put on a display of sorrow on her Hundsturgel, but she didn't dare to get angry at or be rude to Israel. Medvedev was once again showing off there. And of course, Putin dramatically fell silent, dramatically and cunningly fell silent. And this whole idea of an anti-Western brotherhood of all sorts of backward, cannibalistic, bloodthirst countries has, well, kind of fizzled out. And the Russian Federation, right in front of all the other BRICS lunatics, the very same Russian Federation that was supposed to act decisively in the event of an Israeli-Iranian conflict, it basically, as they say, pardon, the expression just swallowed. Undoubtedly, throughout this entire story, the Russian trait is significant and prominent. And you understand, right, that in the Kremlin, in the General Staff, in the FSB, and in the Duma, there is a stable group of schizophrenics who were running through the corridor, demanding that Russia entered the war on Iran's side. Well, the Kremlin feels awkward. It's clear that the Kremlin set Iran up by promising tech, and that's why Iran became so brazen. Iran became brazen solely because of Moscow's promises of protection, right up to, let's say, some very, very provocative behavior with Trump. In the Duma, there was even the idea of creating some sort of parliamentary company sent to Iran. But in truth, after getting acquainted with the penetrating power and accuracy of Israeli missiles, those eager to go quickly disappeared. In general, all of Iran's troubles, misfortunes, and nightmares are directly connected to Russia, because the establishment of this total obscurantism in Iran was a major victory for the USSR. Because the Persians were confidently and steadily moving towards civilization and could have, in fact, become a very prosperous, successful, and vibrant part of that civilization. especially given all the fabulous, almost legendary wealth and abundant resources of their country. And in that regard, they really have, as they say, quite a lot going. And we shouldn't lump them in with, let's put it this way, the real Iran shouldn't be classified as obscurantist because, first of all, it's not the Arab world. They're not Arabs at all, they're Persian. And the official language there is Persian, Farsi. Listen, Omar Khayyam, the utterly charming Omar Khayyam was a Persian, just like Hafez. In other words, Iran is made up of those very areas that today's Rus people try to associate themselves with, and the Hitlerites tried to latch onto them. And at one time, the Soviet Union, in order to interrupt Iran's march towards civilization, brought these half-crazed fanatic Ayatollah Khomeini in a sealed train car. And let's not forget that Iran has 16% of the world's total gas reserves and 10% of the oil reserves. These are huge, colossal figures. But nevertheless, what happened happened, and Iran became brazen, its proud posturing and its production of uranium hexafluoride well. That's a typical Russian trait. The Russians promised to provide protection, and believing in the power of their Kremlin friend and his patronage, Iran grew arrogant and disregarded its commitments to never acquire nuclear weapons. And so the Ayatollahs decided to ignore all sorts of deals and sanctions and also become a nuclear power. In response, Israel began relentlessly pounding Iran, trying to knock the arrogance and bravado out of the Ayatollahs and at the same time shatter their faith in Russian protection. Russia, meanwhile, let's be honest, no matter how unpleasant it is for you to hear, keep noisily and fussily sucking up now to America, now to Israel. I don't even know really who deserves more attention first. All of this, all of it is troubling Russian patriots. Oh, and take a close look at my Telegram channel. Besides the entire chronology of the Israeli-Iranian war, there are also some very interesting reactions posted there. In particular, the reaction from that very Abti Aladinov, about the need to mobilize 1 million riflemen who are supposedly the only ones who can save the Russian world. And indeed, overall, the wave of events is growing. It's clear that this is a war between Iran and Israel. This is not something that will be over in a minute. And of course, it should ultimately culminate in the complete overthrow of all these oppressive ayatollahs and the glorious return of a truly magnificent and historically rich country indeed. Iran is an exceptionally magnificent and culturally profound nation to the broader civilized global community. It's clear that all this nightmare, which is already teetering on the brink of nuclear catastrophe so far, regional, but quite capable of escalating into something bigger. It's clear that all these nightmares over there are also the result of a circle of deranged old men in the Kremlin deciding to bring global reality in line with 17th century map and the delusions of the scribbler Dugin. By the way, just take a look at my Telegram channel. I posted the cover of the magazine Crocodile, I think from 1968, and you'll see to what extent Russians, or rather the USSR, had developed this anti-Semitic, anti-Israeli rhetoric, how they had invented images, by the way, quite cleverly, maliciously, graphically, and professionally. Today's propaganda isn't as skilled at this, but I suspect they'll make use of all the old playbook and, of course, will still defend the Iranian side as their closest like-minded allies and support. On the front, let's put it this way, there's a somewhat encouraging lull in the sense that the Russians aren't even creeping forward, not even a little. As for the Sumy region, they've actually managed to straighten out the line there. The Russians, well, you see, you can't really say the Russians have been driven out either, because when people talk about Russians entering the Sumy region, It later turns out it was just a sabotage group of 6 invalids, 3 of whom, due to their size, couldn't make it and, out of despair, took their own lives. And look at my no, don't look at my Telegram channel because it's not meant for you. I specifically posted an advertisement there for those who are considering signing a contract with the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation. And of course, there are also some relevant field surgery photos there. Of course, for anyone who wants to acquire a truly vivid, unforgettable individuality, a contract with the Ministry of Defense can offer unique opportunities to become unlike anyone else. We talk a lot about torn off arms, torn off leg, deaths, all sorts of maggots, but for some reason, the huge number of so-called facial traumatic mine explosion injury, which make up as much as 10% are overlooked. In addition to the obvious loss of a nose or eyes, there can also be the tearing off of cheeks, lips, the jaw, the mandible, the lower jaw, and even part of the oral cavity, all the way up to the palatine tonsils. Drones and mines are exceptionally effective at causing all of this. It's clear that many contract soldiers will never have a silly or inappropriate smile because that smile will be torn off and thrown onto the nearest aspect. And of course, the victim's face becomes so unique that even horseflies approaching it well, I don't know, even they die of heart. Well, of course, there are facial prosthetics, but they're even scarier than the scar. And I included, for those who decide to sign a contract and don't mind losing a leg for Putin, both archival and modern photos, as well as the very latest images from the front lines. And here's yet another particularly significant point, one that truly characterizes the overall mood and the unfolding events front. Now, waging this senseless war of theirs, the Russians are stubbornly returning to the caves, to their origins, to displays of unimaginable savagery. And today, during the prisoner exchange, during yet another exchange with prisoners, this was clearly visible. Remember, back in the day, the ancient Semitestis was around the 5th or 6th century BC, well, at least the 4th, according to the book of Judges. Yes, probably the 4th century. The ancient Semites would cut off the thumbs of captured Canaanites. They would chop them off. This completely deprived them of the ability to hold a spear or a sword. However, this was something that not only the Semites liked to do. You can read about it in the book of Judges, chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. This method of mutilating hands, of mutilating the forelimbs of captives, was popular among the Pygmy tribes of equatorial Africa, among the Tasmanians, and in fact, among very many others. And today, during a prisoner exchange, a young Ukrainian from Sloviansk was found among those returned to Ukraine, whose finger, the one usually used to pull the trigger, had been cut off or chopped off by the Russians, who explained to him that he would no longer need it. And also, check out my Telegram channel for an absolutely charming video, no blood, no explosions of Russian Azov fighters surrendering. And it seems that the seasoned frontline orcs know that surrendering to Azov is nothing but a pleasure. The process of taking prisoners there is almost lyrical gentleno kicking, no lecture. And from this video, it's easy to notice that there isn't even that typical forgivable nervousness you'd expect in such a way. And the seasoned Russian Urukhais surrender themselves just like drunks use turn in empty bottles, willingly, in an orderly fashion, and cheerfully. Well, of course, the front is vast. Not everyone is lucky enough to experience such happiness. And just look, even in the video, there are these funny boys, the Abdumans, whose commanders fill their heads with stories about how they would be tortured and executed, and who absolutely do not believe or understand that they have ended up in captivity in a completely different reality where no one is going to execute them, where no one is going to beat them, where no one is going to drive them into senseless meat grinder assault. And for them, of course, this elegance of the Azov style of taking prisoners is a huge pride. It's truly heartfelt, and out of all the frontline videos, perhaps even the most pleasant one. Meanwhile, in Russia, things are getting more and more cheerful, even though, as it turns out, only the most notorious gloomy Russophobes can claim that Russians are completely deprived of the right to vote. No, they are not deprived of the right to vote. It's just that the freedom of speech that once existed has been trimmed down a bit to the freedom of a single letter. Because, as it turns out, the regime still allows citizens to gather once a year and shout whatever comes into their lungs or throats. So, it turns out that in Russia, shouting out any individual letters of the Russian or even, say, the Latin alphabet is not prohibited. There is, however, a strict rule that must be followed. Shouting out words or even, for example, syllables is not allowed. But mostly there's a video on a Telegram channel. There were about 300 to 400 people on the Trinity Bridge in St. Petersburg. And for the most part, of course, they shout out the usual letters like Ani, although it's considered acceptable to shout, for example, even the letter Yi, which sounds more striking and much more dramatic than Yi. Well, and some brave, daring folks even go for the letter O and shout out the letter O. But of course, people like that are immediately noticed by the FSB agents, who are thickly mixed into the shouting crowd. And the police and Orthodox activists take note of them too, because shouting the letter O in this situation is a clear signal that these citizens should be dealt with, since that's practically treason up to 15 years. Well, Russians technically have the right to exercise their freedom of speech, but only very early, very, very early. And of course, far away from government buildings and institutions. And you know, this slave-like pleasure of shouting is more than enough for Russians. They disperse, satisfied, feeling almost like Decembrist rebels and heroes. And against the backdrop of all this nightmare, against the backdrop of everything that's happening, we suddenly see an absolute hit on the internet. We see a young woman from the city of Sheleko, a woman named Maria, who, fully aware of all the consequences for herself, tells Russian that the medals they received for the special military operation are a mark of shame, a disgrace. She calls them murder and calls the special military operation nonsense and treachery. That is to say, of course, in this courage and in this clarity of mind of an ordinary Russian woman, there is something absolutely extraordinary for our time. She is not an opposition figure, not a writer, not a journalist, not a politician, not a deputy. So this young woman from a provincial town just stood up and told the whole country what she really thinks and feels about the special military operation, about this senseless and criminal war of Putin. It's clear that she's an ordinary person and her fear must have been immense. But sometimes it happens that shame, pain break through that fear from within. And she managed to do it. And most likely right now, the angel of history is already inscribing her name in gold alongside those names. The names of those who also overcame this slavish instinct, the Russian slavish instinct. Well, of course, they pounced on her. She's already in a psychiatric hospital where they'll break her and possibly force some kind of apology out of her, but that won't matter anymore. But you know what I think is the most curious thing about this whole story? What's the most surprising part? If you were to thoroughly get Skabieva completely and utterly drunk, or perhaps give the fervent and patriotic Buzova a substantial dose of thiopental, that particular and potent substance, often referred to as the so-called truth serum, they would inevitably end up saying pretty much the exact same things as Maria, without any significant deviation After all, everyone in Russia understands everything because it's impossible not to see the vile things the Kremlin is doing. Everyone understands, but everyone lives in a state of proper fear. And now there's an event coming up called the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. And you'll be able to see just how many Russians find comfort in that fear, how many of them feel at ease living under fascism. It's as if their souls are in perfect harmony with this fascism, as long as they're allowed to stick out their behinds, go shopping, gorge themselves, and pretend to live a glamorous life. Another shameful circus of the St. Petersburg Economic Forum is about to begin. The governor of the Leningrad region, Drozdenko, is already shaking like a gnome on a jackhammer, anticipating the avalanche of Ukrainian drones that will fly over his region and could hit the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, killing countless innocent prostitutes because, well, strictly speaking, the forum probably only being held now so the girls can make some money, since it hasn't had any real political or economic purpose for a long time. But actually, they say Volokhova is going to the forum with a dazzling project. And it will feature a unique act because, as it turns out, Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky has a special version of Swan Lake Turkey Lake. For overweight elderly ballerinas, it's almost the same thing, just much slower. Well, among the great thinkers expected there are Volokhova, of course, Dugin, and naturally Jigurda. Ablahassin will be shouting about Goida. And the resurrected, once again admitted to polite society, Krasovsky will be practically giving away AIDS for free in restroom number 8 on the 3rd floor of the building. He's there. He's already there, as it turns out. And having tilted his Cossack hat to the side, he has already taken up his position and is in a state of full readiness. But I promise you that we, of course, will still, as they say, dance around this topic in the near future. So let me remind you that you can order the book, The Origin of Genius and Fascism, and find out for yourself and decide the question of what exactly is genius, what exactly is giftedness. What are the main signs? Where does it come? What is the evolutionary history of all these phenomena? And does it even exist at all? Because anything that doesn't have an evolutionary history, simply doesn't exist. That's already religious nonsense. So that's basically the most important thing. Glory to Ukraine. Long live Belarus. And let me remind you about the political prisoner who must be exchanged by any means necessary, and pressure must be put on those people who can make it happen. Because if this is left in the hands of people like Karamurza and Yashin, then of course they will try to dig up someone from Russia who is just like themselves. That is, people who are neither ideologues nor fighters nor heroes in any sense. But what we need are heroes. We need that front and informational ideological front that will break the foundations of Putinism. Goodbye, everyone.